On September 1, 1983, a Soviet fighter jet shot down a Korean Boeing 747 airliner over Sakhalin, resulting in the deaths of 269 people, all passengers and crew members. The plane crash became a landmark event, a true turning point in the Cold War. It sparked a major international scandal and greatly escalated the already tense relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. This tragedy is well known, but few people know that the Sakhalin Boeing was far from the first civilian aircraft shot down by the valiant Soviet anti-aircraft gunners. 5 years earlier, in April 1978, they attacked another airliner full of passengers over the Kola Peninsula. And only thanks to a lucky coincidence, as well as the great skill of the pilots, was it possible to avoid numerous casualties. What is most surprising is that both planes shot down by Soviet missiles belong to the same Korean company, Korean Airlines. So let's figure out what happened on this ill-fated Korean Boeing flight, why it ended up in Soviet airspace, and how the Soviet military acted in that situation. My name is Semyon, and this is Megashot Television starting. He was going to Odessa but ended up in Kherson. This story happened on April 20th, 1978, when a Boeing 707 of the Korean airline Korean Airlines took off on its usual route from Paris to Seoul. On the way, it had a scheduled stop for refueling in Anchorage. There were 97 passengers and 12 crew members on board the airliner. The aircraft was commanded by 46-year-old Kim Chang-kyu, an experienced pilot, retired Air Force colonel, and a veteran of the Korean War. The flight was normal for a long time, safely crossing Britain, the North Atlantic, and Greenland before the airliner encountered problems. In the area of the Earth's north magnetic pole, its navigation equipment failed, the gyroscopic semi-compass. Another version says the crew miscalculated by using wrong magnetic declination values. The worst part is the pilots didn't notice the mistake and kept flying. The Boeing went off course and also made a right turn and banked. Making a huge arc, it actually flew in the opposite direction, to the south, toward the Soviet-Finnish border. After flying over Spitsbergen, the plane began rapidly approaching Soviet territorial waters. The incident over the Kola Peninsula. The Soviet air defense system detected the plane 400 kilometers before it reached the territorial waters border. The object was moving at high speed towards Severomorsk and Murmansk at an altitude of 9 kilometers, not responding to identification signal requests. Later, Moscow claimed it tried to contact the plane, but all attempts were ignored. Sure, we believe that. Rhetorical question, never mind. The air defense officers didn't know what was approaching, and chaos erupted. Several theories were proposed. Theories included a naval aviation aircraft crew forgetting to change the identification code, an An-12 returning from the Barents Sea, and a Tu-95 reconnaissance plane. Sergei Slobochikov, pilot of the 265th Fighter Aviation Regiment, recalled being surprised when he listened to the radio. There was such a commotion. I could hear both Murmansk and Petrozavodsk. Everyone was shouting, everyone was giving orders. They argued, shouted, and disrupted official phone lines. A strange intruder entered Soviet airspace. A Su-15TM fighter from the 431st Air Regiment was scrambled to intercept it, piloted by Captain Alexander Bosov. What was happening on the Boeing then? The pilots realized they were off course. Even before they reached the border with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they tried to contact the ground, but all attempts were in vain. The crew finally realized they were definitely not over Alaska when they flew over Murmansk. It was just too different from any Canadian or American city. Alexander Bosov approached the intruder and immediately identified it as a passenger airliner. He also reported seeing maple leaves on the plane, which caused quite a commotion on the ground. It turned out that a Canadian, that is, a NATO plane, had flown deep into Soviet territory. Later, however, Bosov corrected himself, reporting that there was some inscription in Asian characters on the fuselage and a picture of a stork on the tail. It was clear the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' airspace was violated by a passenger airliner, but communication between the two planes still couldn't be established. Soviet sources claimed that Bosov's fighter repeatedly rocked its wings at the intruder, trying to force the airliner to follow him. What really happened there is unknown, but after some time, the Boeing changed course and headed toward Finland. There were about 80 kilometers left to the border, just 6 or 7 minutes of flight. But the captain of the South Korean Boeing, Kim Chan-kyu, described the events quite differently. He claimed that he saw the Soviet fighter jet, signaled to it with his aircraft lights, and even tried to contact it on the international frequency. Unfortunately, it was to no avail. These attempts were recorded by the Finnish Air Traffic Control Tower. Eyewitnesses said people on the ground couldn't decide what to do with the airliner for a long time. The pilot was receiving orders simultaneously from the Army Air Defense Command Post and the Corps Command Post, and often these orders contradicted each other and were mixed with threats to court-martial the pilot. In the end, Bossov received the order to attack and destroy the intruder, since his aircraft was running out of fuel. To the credit of the Soviet pilot, he did everything he could to dissuade his superiors from this idea, apparently not wanting to become a killer of innocent civilians. There is an order in the army from close range. The fighter jet fired 2 missiles at the Boeing, one of which missed, while the other tore off part of the left wing, damaged one of the engines, and caused the cabin to depressurize. Missile fragments killed 2 passengers. After that, the airliner began to rapidly lose altitude and disappeared from Soviet radar screens. A piece of the wing was detected on radar and mistaken for a dangerous object, a missile or a container with spy equipment. 2 more fighter jets were sent to intercept it. The damaged Boeing descended from 9 kilometers to 700 meters and entered the clouds. Bossov lost it and could no longer continue the pursuit because his plane was running out of fuel. Several more fighters were sent into the sky to pursue the intruder. The Boeing was eventually found flying at 500 meters, clearly searching for a landing spot. And then the Soviet pilots witnessed a real miracle worthy of an honorable place in aviation history, the Karelian miracle. I'm sure many of you have heard about the miracle on the Hudson, when the crew landed an airliner with failed engines right on the water of the Hudson River in New York. That time, the pilot's skill saved the lives of 150 passengers. Later, Hollywood made a pretty good movie based on this story, starring Tom Hanks in the main role. However, what happened late in the evening on April 20th, 1978 in Karelia is way cooler than the American events and definitely deserves a good screenplay. After being hit by a Soviet missile, the Boeing circled at low altitude for an hour and 40 minutes, burning fuel and searching for a place to land. It crossed the entire Kola Peninsula and had already entered Karelia. In the end, the pilots managed to land their plane on the ice of Lake Karpijärvi near the village of Loukhi. How they managed to do it is still a mystery, because the landing took place at 23:05 Moscow time, that is, in complete darkness. And on top of that, with part of the wing missing, 1 engine not working, damaged hydraulics, and a hole in the fuselage, it's unclear how the pilots managed to spot a more or less flat area, large enough to land a huge airliner. The crew members later said that they almost crashed when they started to land on a railroad, mistaking it for a highway. Then they started looking for a lake with a straight shoreline, but one had a power line running across it. Another had an island in the middle, and only the third body of water met the necessary requirements. The plane landed gear down in the middle of the lake, slid across the ice, and stopped at the shore. Here the airliner's passengers got lucky once again. That year, spring came late in Karelia. At the end of April, the ice on the lake was strong enough to support the multi-ton Boeing. Roughly 2 hours later, military personnel and rescuers arrived at the site of the plane's hard landing. From Paris to Loukhi. Of course, the passengers suffered the most. Just imagine what they had to go through. A missile attack, someone killed and wounded on board, cabin depressurization, and the plane going into a steep dive. I think they said goodbye to life more than once. Valery Desyatkov, a KGB investigator from Karelia, later said the plane's cabin was covered in blood. But not from wounds, it was just that because of the pressure drop, people had blood coming from their noses and ears. Flying home from glamorous Paris, and hours later finding yourself in the snowy, remote taiga of a country the West had heard terrifying rumors about is quite an adventure. On the plane, there were citizens of 4 countries: South Korea, Japan, France, and West Germany. For the residents of the village of Loukhi, the landing of the Boeing was a real event, something that could only be compared to the arrival of aliens. By morning, almost all of its residents had run to the lake to see the unprecedented wonder. For many, it was likely their first time seeing an airplane. They weren't permitted near the airliner, which was strictly guarded by the military and serious men in civilian clothes. Not only did they keep onlookers away from the secret object, but they also confiscated their cameras without a word, exposing the film. They were armed and prepared for the possibility of having to fight against cunning saboteurs who had brazenly violated the state border. In reality, the saboteurs were freezing, terrified civilians who had to be carried from the cabin. Many men wore shorts and women wore high heels. Passengers and crew were taken by helicopter and bus to the nearest district center and housed in the officers' club. Parents with small children were accommodated in the local hospital. A tent camp was set up next to the Boeing, housing KGB and main intelligence directorate officers, as well as representatives from major Soviet aviation research institutes. Well, how else? Open sources reveal Sloaner was removed, along with the emergency radio station and fuel drain system, and wing honeycomb filler samples were collected. They never found any spy equipment on the 707, even after dismantling it completely. However, that didn't stop the Soviet authorities from accusing the plane of carrying out a reconnaissance mission. The end of the story. A few days later, the passengers were flown to Murmansk, then sent to Helsinki. But the commander and the navigator were detained in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics for another week. Apparently, they were pressured and forced to take responsibility for the incident. In the end, the pilots admitted their guilt and wrote a letter of repentance to the Supreme Soviet of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were immediately pardoned and quickly expelled from the country. So in this case, everything ended happily as well. Everyone made it home and got off with just a scare. However, once in the West, the commander and the navigator stated that they did not admit any guilt and did not ask the Soviet authorities for anything. The Soviet side refused to conduct international investigations and did not hand over the flight recorders. Instead, shortly after the incident, a government commission was created, headed by Marshal of Aviation Ivan Pstiga. It found the actions of the military to be correct and justified. All the blame for the incident fell on the aviation crew. An important point is that the commission was not immediately able to determine who exactly gave the order to destroy the Boeing. Because the recordings of the communications of the command post of the 21st Air Defense Corps were strangely erased. None of the pilots or commanders who intercepted the South Korean airliner were punished. They received no awards or promotions, and the country never heard about the Korean Boeing crash in Karelia. Local media were strictly banned from reporting on this incident. A few hours after the disaster, a short message appeared in Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, fully reflecting the official position of Moscow. They reported an unidentified aircraft violated Soviet airspace. It did not respond to commands and landed on a lake in Karelia. The report said nothing about the plane being shot down or its passengers. Soviet citizens learned about the Karelian episode of the Korean Boeing much later during the Perestroika era. The Soviet Union billed the Korean airline $100,000 for the maintenance of the passengers and crew of the downed plane. They were also offered to take back the airliner, provided they paid for its evacuation. The Koreans did not agree to this, so the planes were dismantled and delivered in parts to one of the airfields near Moscow. No official claims regarding this incident were made against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by the government of South Korea or the International Civil Aviation Organization. However, it was not easy to file such claims anyway, since there were no diplomatic relations between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Republic of Korea until 1990. The residents of Loukhi and its surroundings greatly benefited. As soon as the barriers were removed, they rushed in to loot and take away everything left at the crash site, from pieces of aluminum plating to disposable tableware. A local man reportedly installed a few cabin seats in his UAZ and drove with them for 25 more years. Vladimir Dmitriev, the air defense chief, also took seats from the Korean Boeing. He installed 12 on his personal Il-14 and shamelessly boasted about it in his memoirs. We saw something similar in 2014 at the crash site of the Malaysian Boeing in Donbass. Captain Kim Chan-kyu returned to Korean Airlines. Before retiring, he managed to log 30,000 flight hours and worked as an instructor, passing on his experience to young pilots. The fate of another key figure in this drama, Captain Alexander Bosov, is unknown. After the incident with the Boeing, the pilot was quickly transferred to the Far East, where his trail disappears. It can be added that on that fateful day, fate, or perhaps higher powers, favored the Soviet pilot and allowed him to avoid the unenviable fate of being the killer of hundreds of innocent people. Overall, no conclusions were drawn from the events in Karelia. 5 years later, the situation repeated over Sakhalin, but this time with hundreds of victims and major reputational damage for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. When Soviet propaganda began to habitually lie to the world about the incident, it only made the situation worse. However, that's a completely different story which you can find on the channel. Goodbye. Subtitles.